Alright, so this is Joy Hakim's A History of U.S., Volume D, Chapter 53, Troubled Cities. There had been enormous changes in the 2 decades since the end of World War II. Martin Luther King Jr. could look at the South with some satisfaction. Where segregation had once flourished, black Americans and white people now worked together, voted together, went to school together, ate in restaurants together, and rode on buses together. The changes were amazing to those who knew the old South. The new racial harmony had helped bring in industry and a progressive spirit to the South. The region was thriving. But when King decided to take his movement north, into big city ghettos, he discovered problems that were tougher than he had ever faced before. He had believed that the methods that worked in the South would work in other regions too, but the situation was different in America's northern cities. In the South, the problem had been Jim Crow laws and police-enforced segregation. The solution was to get the laws changed and get the police to enforce those laws. The job wasn't finished, but the laws were in place and the direction was clear. There were no Jim Crow laws in the North or West. The urban nightmare had nothing to do with laws. The problem there was economic, which means it has to do with money. The cities were filled with poor people, white, black, brown, who weren't being given a chance to rise out of poverty. Usually they went to schools that were tattered and poor, where they couldn't get good training for the new kinds of jobs that technology was bringing. But there were hardly any jobs in the inner cities anyway. Many city people were almost without hope. Young black Americans in cities were full of frustration and rage. Over here, this picture says that children play in the dirt and debris of a crowded slum on New York City's Lower East Side. Over here it says flourish means to grow and thrive. A ghetto is a seedy neighborhood where poor people live crowded together, usually in bad conditions. It comes from an Italian word used to describe a walled section of a city where Jews were required to live apart from the rest of the townspeople. Oh dear. Guess it took too long to load. Alright, so this picture up here. As President Johnson sent more young Americans to Vietnam, more and more people turned against the war, while the war's ever-increasing cost made it hard to pay for Johnson's domestic reforms. Over here is a banner that says, "Out Now," for Army troops. And urban white Americans? When King marched in the Chicago area, he was met with white hatred more vicious than anything he had encountered in Mississippi or Alabama. Many of the city's white Americans were poor too. They were competing with African Americans for jobs, and there weren't enough jobs to go around. Instead of coming together, black people and white people seemed to be growing further and further apart. Some leaders on both sides were even encouraging hatred. President Johnson still hadn't found a way out of Vietnam. He was putting pressure on those, like Martin Luther King Jr., who protested against the war. It was a tough time for King. John Kennedy's brother, Robert, or Bobby Kennedy, was telling him he needed to bring his battle for justice north. Kennedy said the same thing to the ministers and the others who had gone south. Martin Luther King Jr. decided to begin a new campaign. It would be a campaign against poverty. King's program was aimed at, all the poor, including the 2/3 of them who are white. Poverty was not just an African American problem or just a white problem. It was a national disgrace. King planned to bring poor people to Washington. This would not be a one-day march. They would stay. They would camp out in the city. The government leaders would have to pay attention. King believed that eliminating poverty made economic sense and was the right thing to do. If you turn the poor into purchasers, King said, they will solve many of their own problems. The vast amounts of money that the nation spent on military goods could be used to make life better for all people. Poverty has no justification in our age, he said. War is obsolete. He believed that nonviolence was the way nations must learn to solve their differences. But time was running out for King and his nonviolent ideas. King talked over his problems with Bobby Kennedy. So did Cesar Chavez. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Kennedy really seemed to care about poor people. Few other politicians did. The senator was now on the campaign trail, attempting to win the Democratic nomination for president, and it looked as if he might do it. This picture over here shows Bobby Kennedy campaigning for the Senate in Philadelphia. He said, "All of us have a great lesson to learn, the importance of getting a dialogue going between people in the North and the South." Civil rights for Native Americans. The civil rights movement inspired Indian leaders. They, too, had faced discrimination and persecution. They knew many who were Indian pretended to be otherwise because they were ashamed of their heritage. But that was changing. In the state of Washington, tribes held fish-ins to protest restrictions on their treaty-given right to harvest salmon. In Minneapolis, urban Indians created AIM, the American Indian Movement, and shouted of red power. In San Francisco, like-minded Indians formed Indians of all tribes, and when the Bureau of Indian Affairs refused to listen to their grievances, they seized an abandoned federal prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay and held it for a year and a half. Traditionally, Indians had focused on their tribal identity. Alcatraz was a pan-Indian action. That means that Indians from tribes that had sometimes been one another's enemy were now banding together. Although it didn't happen easily, many tribes, especially those on reservations, were still determined to go their own way. The militant activities went with Alcatraz to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, where they staged a protest occupation in 1972. Next, they took over a trading post at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where there had been a terrible massacre of Indians in 1890. Those very dramatic takeovers accomplished what was intended. They made non-Indians aware of Indian grievances, and they made some Indians rediscover and take new pride in their heritage. Native Americans also achieved success in the courts. Again and again, the courts decided in their favor in disputes over rights granted in treaties many signed 100 years or more earlier. In 1971, Aleuts, Eskimos, and other native Alaskans won 40 million acres of land and nearly $1 billion in settlements of long-standing claims. In Maine, Penobscots received either 81 or $31 million for claims based on a law passed in 1790. Several other tribes which received similar awards. Here it says that part of the former federal prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco burns in the last days of Indian occupation on the island in 1971. The Indians who occupied Alcatraz offered to pay $24 in beads and cloth for it, the price paid for Manhattan 300 years earlier. Overall, however, things were still not good for many Native Americans. Alcoholism devastated whole peoples. Unemployment was high on reservations and among urban Indians, but some Indian entrepreneurs were taking a new look at Indian reservations, which were nations within a nation and thus not subject to most state requirements. Indian business people realized that the status of reservations allowed for activities that were often illegal outside, like gambling. In the 1980s and 90s, casinos began to bring enormous wealth, which meant jobs, good schools, and nice homes, along with controversy and power to some Indian reservations. Other things were happening. In Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Institution returned Indian skeletal remains and funeral objects to their rightful owners. In Colorado, voters elected an American Indian, Ben Nighthorse Campbell, a representative to the U.S. Congress, and as a senator in 1992. And in Oklahoma, Wilma Mankiller, the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation, spoke of her firm belief that 500 years from now, there will be strong tribal communities of native people in the Americas where ancient languages, ceremonies, and songs will be heard. If so, all the people of the land will be richer for it. Over here shows an AIM activist standing at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And over here is Wilma Mankiller, who served as the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation. Alright, that is it for chapter 53. Please enjoy. This has been Jenna!